Liberalism is out of fashion. You might say it's under siege.
From the populist right to the progressive left, limited government, personal freedom, the rule of law, and some of the philosophical ideas underlying those goals, they've all come in for growing criticism.
So we hear a defense of liberalism from Professor Bryan Garsten of Yale.
I think there's a certain language that liberals use of rights and progress and science, which has sometimes been hijacked to justify a certain elite overreach in imposing a vision of the world onto many people with different views in our society. And so that's why I would like to offer this language of refuge as an alternative way to get at what's really morally admirable in liberal societies.
Our show is about fixes.
Yeah, how to make the world a better place.
How do we fix it?
How do we fix it?
In past episodes of How Do We Fix It, we've heard from conservative scholar Matthew Continetti about the right, Nick Gillespie of Reason magazine about what we could learn from libertarians.
And now liberals get their turn. Professor Bryan Garsten wrote about liberalism in the current edition of the Journal of Democracy, and he's our guest on this episode.
Bryan Garsten is a professor of political science at Yale. He's written recent op-eds for the New York Times. Bryan's books include Saving Persuasion, A Defense of Rhetoric and Judgment, and he edited a collection of essays about Rousseau and the Age of Enlightenment. Richard, I didn't get to join you on this one. It's too bad. This is right in my wheelhouse. But you spoke with Bryan Garsten in Connecticut earlier this week.
Professor Bryan Garsten of Yale University, welcome to How Do We Fix It?
Hi, thanks for having me.
The term liberalism is so often misunderstood, even by liberals. What is it to be a liberal?
Well, every society empowers some certain people. And a liberal society is unique in that it offers refuge from the very people that it empowers. So let me give you an example. Some societies are religious, and clergy or an established church plays a very important role in that society. But it could still be a liberal religious society if it offers some places that people who are not directly in tune with the ruling elites can live comfortably. Or a democratic society empowers the people who can win elections. And yet, at any moment in time, there are those who were not aligned with a particular party that just won the election, and a liberal society offers refuge of different kinds in institutions and different political parties. And so a liberal society allows the rest of us to live undisturbed.
You've given an example, but what about a counterexample? Let's say a conservative society. Does that allow refuge to people who don't agree with the dominant view or with those who are elected?
It could. Everything would depend on the particulars. So a conservative society, if we think conservative means, for example, culturally conservative or conservative in terms of family values, perhaps religiously conservative, there might still be more or less liberal versions of such societies. So if such a society had a system of rights and courts to enforce those rights, to allow people who weren't so conservative to live in peace and relatively undisturbed, it would be a more liberal version of a conservative society.
This all sounds enlightened. So why is modern liberalism on the back foot today? It's been harshly criticized by autocrats, populists, and the hard left. So why is liberalism right now out of fashion?
I think there are at least two sorts of reasons for this, because you're absolutely right. Liberals are on the back foot. They're on the defensive. One could point to fear and insecurity. That is, in times of losses of jobs after a mismanaged globalization, in times of high inflation, it's natural for people to become more anxious about living with people that they fundamentally disagree with or who are deeply different from them. So living in a pluralistic society can become especially difficult when you feel insecure or fearful. And there are those who say that in the wake of the inequalities that globalization brought, there's a response that we're seeing. You could also point to a certain overreach of elites that has made people in certain walks of life feel defensive or insecure, that their way of life is somehow being threatened by a liberal consensus coming from above.
Or perhaps even worse, mocked.
Sure, there's a real sense of disdain. Liberal elites disdain more traditional ways of life. Liberal societies emphasize choice. Liberal societies are filled with different ways of life that one could choose. And the moral concern is that when we face those choices, we end up dissolving traditional communities and ways of life and religions. And there's a concrete example that often comes to people's mind. Marriage. The old worry about allowing divorce, that is, allowing people to leave marriages that they find to be unfulfilling or even abusive, the very availability of divorce, some people worry, dissolves marriage. It makes us less likely to work on difficult marriages in the hard moments. And so it tends to do the same thing, people think, to community in general. That in a liberal society, which offers lots of opportunities for mobility, new starts, tends to make us impatient with the difficulties of life in small communities with others, especially traditional ways of life. And that's a moral concern with liberal societies that I do think lies behind some of the objections we're hearing now.
Let's talk about those other lib words. Let's start with libertarian. To you, what's the difference between liberalism and libertarianism?
Well, libertarians take one strain of liberal thought and emphasize it.
And what is that?
And that strain is basically individual freedom or individual liberty. And the idea there is that we should view ourselves fundamentally as individuals who have certain freedoms that should not be abridged, except if it can clearly be shown that we are harming others in a direct physical way, usually. The objection against libertarians is that they have too individualistic an understanding of who we are as human creatures, and that they tend to prioritize liberty but forget about other human goods like community or equality.
The modern state is certainly much more powerful and reaches into our daily lives far more than it did 100 years ago. Are liberals much more comfortable with state power than libertarians? I would assume so.
Certainly, yes. And now the question is how liberals who are not libertarians can understand the proper use of that state power. And what I suggest is that we should go back to the original justification for the expansion of this state power in the early 20th century in the United States, which was that there had already been an expansion and concentration of economic power. And that liberals wanting to offer refuge from those concentrations of power, that is corporate power, discovered that the state was really the only means by which they could offer that refuge. So whereas earlier liberals were most concerned about states, because the states were the places where you saw power concentrated, once you have the development of very large concentrated corporate power, liberals became concerned about that too. And so now liberalism actually became more complicated.
So when you talk about liberalism offering a refuge from power, this is not just state power. This can also be corporate power. This is especially interesting right now because of the rise in the power of very large technology companies.
Yes, and you can see the issue come up in the question of monopolies and how to think about what's wrong with corporate monopolies, for example, in the tech sector. An old way of looking at that problem said that the main objection to monopolies is that consumer prices rose, that if you had a monopoly on an industry, you could set prices higher than they should be. And therefore, according to that argument, as long as consumer prices were reasonable, there was no objection to that concentration of corporate power. But that understanding has been challenged recently, and we have been asked to consider an even older objection to the concentration of corporate power from early in the 20th century. And that older objection was that there's something worrisome about the concentration of power itself, aside from the price consequences. And what is worrisome is that the rest of us are subject to a power that we have no refuge from.
Oh, give us an example of that.
Today, I think we would point, people tend to be pointing to the technology companies which create the algorithms and dictate the structure of search engines and artificial intelligence and tools that have become so important to our lives that we are really at the mercy of those structures.
And I know that you're a father of adolescent children, and there's also the question of social media and what kind of damage it is doing to children as a result of how its algorithms are designed and how these very large corporations conduct business.
Yeah, I think every parent is intensely worried about their children and how they interact with social media, which is such an important part of many, many children's social lives. And that's actually a good way of thinking about the way in which most of us are at the mercy of the people who determine architecture and the setup of technologies that we use every day.
Let's talk about another lib word, which is neoliberalism. What's the difference, in your view, between modern 21st century liberalism and neoliberalism, which to some extent was embraced by moderate Democrats back in the 80s and 90s, Bill Clinton being the most famous example?
So neoliberalism is one of those words which can mean many different things, but as I understand the clearest use of the word, it refers to an emphasis on markets and the spread of free markets. Neoliberals are often said to have a certain faith in the free market as a better coordinator of human activities than states or organizations. And so neoliberalism is associated with globalization, the sort of trade policies that came about during the time you're pointing to in the 90s and the early 2000s. In the wake of the Cold War, really, there were decisions made by the United States and Europe to put a lot of hope in the spread of markets and to think that political liberalization and democratization would follow economic liberalization. Now, the difference that I would point to between neoliberalism and the liberalism of the sort that I'm defending is that liberals don't need to have a generalized faith in markets, an assumption that markets are always the best solution. Liberals should be very concerned when markets have the effect of concentrating power rather than distributing it or breaking it up.
And yet what we've seen in the past 20 years is a European Union that is much more skeptical of the concentration of corporate power and often has many more government rules around the conduct of business than the United States does, growing at a much slower rate than the US, which would be an argument in favor of saying, well, maybe we should leave our hands off business a little bit more than, say, some of the critics of capitalism would argue.
So that raises a very fundamental question, which is how should we judge if our societies are doing well? Now, economic growth is one measure, to be sure, and economic growth is not easily dismissed because it allows us to live comfortable, secure lives and allows for innovation too, which ideally should eventually benefit many of us. But it's not the only standard. We should also look at the civic consequences of different forms of government and different modes of managing the economy. And if we have a society with high growth, but worsening citizenship, that is, we all begin to feel alienated, we don't feel a sense of agency, we don't feel like we can have an effect on the political world we live in, and we begin to feel threatened by the elites who are in charge, those civic consequences can be just as important to look at when we're evaluating the success of different societies. Now, in Europe, they haven't managed the civic consequences well either, in spite of the regulations on the economy. And so that is, many in Europe feel a lack of connection to, control over, certainly the European regulations. And so there you have, in a way, the worst of both worlds. You have a constrained economic growth, but you haven't bought with that constraint a citizenry that feels connected to its politics and able to pursue goals together.
You're listening to Richard's interview with Bryan Garsten. We'll have a conversation where I get to say a few things later in the show.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll have a few things to say. This is How Do We Fix It? I'm Richard Davies.
And I'm Jim Meggs. Hear more of our episodes about politics and public life at howdowefixit.me or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember that we always ask our guests about some ways to think about solutions so we can learn better ways to improve the dialogue in our public square with a goal of making the world better. Now back to our interview.
We've been talking about criticisms of liberalism from the right. What about from the left? Because to me, there's been a huge difference in the spirit and the conduct of student protests in the past year or so over Gaza, over Israel, compared with the protests against the Vietnam War in the late 1960s that also convulsed college campuses. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I think there is a suspicion of liberalism, certainly that comes from parts of the progressive left. And the suspicion views liberals as compromisers, really. When I speak about offering refuge, that can seem like a compromise with injustice or racism to some on the progressive left. I think it's interesting, you mentioned the student protests recently. I think it's interesting to look at the particular theory of organizing that we've seen in those protests. That is to take a bit of land on the central part of campus.
You mean the tent encampments, yeah.
Yeah, and to control who can enter. So many who are sympathetic to the protests, and I'm sympathetic to many of the students who just are concerned about violence that they see against civilians and want it to end. I understand that impulse. But the mode of protest in which you create a wonderful encampment full of blankets and people taking care of one another and having good discussions by keeping out the people who deeply disagree, that mode of protest, I would say, does have something of this progressive illiberalism to it. There's a hesitation about engaging with people who disagree with you.
Some would say it's much more than a hesitation.
In some instances it is. In some instances that there's a real intolerance that one can find. But look, there are a lot of different kinds of people in these protests, and I think it's important not to generalize about everyone attending them. But amongst the organizers and those who press certain strategies of organizing most insistently, there, I would say, is where you see the illiberalism of the left most obviously.
Okay, so How Do We Fix It? A show that, at least to some extent, is about solutions. How do you think that liberalism should not only be defended, but advocated for? What are some of your thoughts about solutions?
I think it helps to recognize just how inspiring and admirable some examples from the past of our own American liberal history can be. I point in a paper I recently published to George Washington, who gathered an army, defeated the greatest empire of his time, but offered a clear vision of the purpose of that victory. He often loved to quote one passage from the Bible, from the book of Micah, which speaks of everyone sitting in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. And this is sort of a vision of the society we hope for. Now, with that vision in mind, what principles would we come up with? We would come up with principles that everyone demands a certain degree of protection or refuge from the elites and the powerful who threaten us in different ways. In practice, that looks like a set of rights and a set of institutions to protect those rights. That means courts empowered to protect rights, and it means a healthy civil society full of the opportunity to create different groups and political parties and associations and churches and synagogues and mosques. And these are familiar features of liberalism. I think sometimes we have lost track of the motivating vision or ideal behind them.
Another case in favor of liberalism that you've written about is that liberal societies don't produce refugees.
I think that's one way that we can spot how liberal a society is. If there are enough internal places within a society for those out of favor at the moment with the current regime, then the pressure for those people to have to leave the country entirely, to become refugees, is not as great. And so liberal societies tend not to produce outward refugee flows. Now, the United States is an example. And we could look back in history and find moments when there were refugees flowing out of the United States. For example, Black Americans flowing to Canada before emancipation. And that was a sign of the illiberalism of the United States in that particular domain. So I think that we can think of liberal societies as those that aim to incorporate enough internal diversity and pluralism so that they produce no exodus of people fleeing them, feeling they have to go elsewhere.
Do we need to reframe liberalism?
I think we do. I think there's a certain language that liberals use of rights and progress and science, which has sometimes been hijacked to justify a certain elite overreach in imposing a vision of the world onto many people with different views in our society. And so that's why I would like to offer this language of refuge as an alternative way to get at what's really morally admirable in liberal societies.
You've talked several times about elites, and yet you are a professor of politics at one of the most elite universities in the country. So are you recognizing that there has been elite overreach in America, especially in the last decade or so, from populists and others?
I think that's true. I think there is a new split that has emerged in American society, first of all, between cities and more rural areas, linked to that between college-educated and the majority who do not attend four-year colleges.
That's right. It's like 2/3 of Americans do not have a four-year college degree.
That's right. And then even between the elite colleges of the kind that I teach at and the rest. And those cleavages, I think, are dangerous. And if one is a Democrat in any sense of the word, one has to really pay attention to the moral source of the populist complaint. Now, I am on record as not favoring the electoral choices associated with populism. But I think it's a mistake to not pay attention to the moral protest that is fueling at least part of the populist resistance.
Bryan Garsten, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Our interview with Bryan Garsten and our conversation, lively as it will be, coming up in a minute. But first, a recommendation.
What do we have? A podcast, a movie, a TV show, Richard?
No, a book. Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present is the latest offering by Fareed Zakaria. And he has some interesting thoughts about past revolutions. He clearly writes about our current time, but reminds readers that we've had times of tumult and division in the past, and we're going through something like that now. And I find it almost refreshing when I get really depressed about the future of democracy or worry about Trump being in the White House again, to go back and look at previous ages, previous times when the political order was threatened, or when it looked like the dark side of politics was getting the upper hand, and see that, America has survived past convulsions and will do so again.
Well, let's hope. Certainly our institutions are more durable than those of Russia, China, and other places that went through wrenching revolutions and did not have such happy outcomes.
So the book is The Age of Revolutions, Fareed Zakaria. Next, our conversation. Okay, Jim, I've had the floor so far. So what do you think?
Well, what an interesting interview, Richard. And I think the students at Yale, surrounded as they are with a lot of fashionable nonsense at times, in addition to some, I'm sure, great scholarship, how lucky they are to have a professor like Bryan Garsten, who brings not just some sense of history and the values of the Enlightenment to bear in his ideas, but also a style of discourse which is calm and thoughtful and open to discussion. And that's, of course, what our show's all about.
You're not a liberal. So where did you differ from him?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, my first problem, and it's not a criticism of his work, is that this word liberal has become so stretched, has become virtually meaningless in our modern society. People with radically different ideas about how the government should work can both call themselves liberal today. When I hear Bryan talking about his idea of refuge, I love this concept that our political structures are largely designed to create a refuge from the people that our society empowers, particularly from government officials. And that is an idea that goes back to the Magna Carta. It's deeply embedded in traditions from the Enlightenment. And today those ideas read more conservative, and I don't mean Trumpian populism. I mean the kind of traditional conservatism that we heard about, a few months back with Matthew Continetti. The idea that one of our most important goals should be limiting government power in order to preserve individual freedom.
I think you're right to point out that the term liberalism is poorly understood and poorly defined by most. In fact, I was reading a poll from Gallup which said that Democrats have become more liberal. And I thought, well, actually, in some cases, they've become less liberal because being progressive is not necessarily being liberal. And these terms, both liberalism and conservatism, traditional conservatism, is also very poorly defined. You keep reading that Trump supporters are from the right, and yes, they are, but a very different kind of right than, say, a Ronald Reagan right or even a George W. Bush right.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, one of the hallmark things about that movement is that it embraces a lot of left-wing ideas about how the world works. And The left used to be the champion of the downtrodden regular guy against the elites, and now the populist right has picked that up. But one of the really great points that he made is this notion that liberal societies don't create refugees. They don't have people fleeing from the problems of their rule. If you look at a society like Venezuela, that was the darling of the American left for many years for their kind of Marxist-inspired policies of nationalization and equality, and the country is a absolute, went from the wealthiest country in South America to one of the poorest in just 20 years. People are fleeing from Venezuela. That's a lesson in what happens when you try to apply some of these far left ideas, not liberal, but far left. But I would say that we're seeing a much more modest version of something like that in the U.S. The U.S. is big enough that we can have huge migration flows within our borders. And also because of our system of individual states with their own policies, we get lots of laboratories of different kinds of approaches to civil society. And what are we seeing? Well, California, one of our most liberal states, huge outmigration in recent years. You see, New York has lost a lot of population. Another state with some of the highest taxes, highest regulations. People are voting with their feet. So the population of the South has just in 2023 grew by something like 1.3 million. States that have much more what we would call conservative governments, and they're leaving states like Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, California. I think it's a sign of a problem when ordinary, non-political, middle-class people are finding they can't live under a certain system because it's restricting their opportunities, or in some ways their freedoms, or just their safety, or their sense of refuge from power. I think that's something that maybe, Richard, we've always had this dialogue between my more libertarian conservative views and your more very mainstream liberal views. I think your side, the mainstream liberals, you guys need to work on this and figure out where's the line between your liberalism and the extremism that's freaking a lot of people out.
I agree, and I think that it's not only conservatives who would say that. I mean, Ezra Klein, the New York Times columnist who also has an excellent podcast, is writing a book about this very subject. This is an interesting tension, but just to make a final point, I do like Bryan Garsten's references to refugees and to refuge. And a final thought, thank you to the Journal of Democracy for making us aware of this dialogue over liberalism in their latest issue. And they also connected me with Bryan Garsten, and thank you for that. This is How Do We Fix It?
I'm Jim Meigs.
And I'm Richard Davies, and our producer is Miranda Schaefer. As always, thanks for joining us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.